Donald Trump stands before a war memorial. What he notices sparks a nationwide investigation. The autumn wind whispered through the towering oaks of Arlington National Cemetery as President Donald Trump stepped out of the black SUV. There were no flashing cameras, no choreographed speeches, just the quiet rustle of leaves and the solemn presence of history. His security detail kept a respectful distance as he strode toward the war memorial, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady. He had been here before, but this time felt different. The weight of his second term, the unspoken responsibility to those who had given everything, pressed against his chest. Rows of names stretched before him, etched into the marble with precision. Each one a life given in service, a sacrifice that demanded remembrance. Trump moved slowly, taking his time to absorb the enormity of what stood before him. His fingers traced a name here and there, not out of ceremony, but out of something deeper, an unspoken promise that none of them would be forgotten. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed at a section of the wall, a crease forming between his brows. Something was off. The names followed a pattern, alphabetical, regimented, but in this particular space, there was a break, an unnatural gap where a name should have been. His gaze flicked across the surrounding engravings, confirming his suspicion. The missing name wasn't a simple oversight. It was deliberate. Someone had been erased. Behind him, a soft cough broke the silence. Trump turned to see an older man standing nearby, his uniform jacket neatly pressed, despite its years of wear. The man's silver hair and hardened expression suggested he had seen more than most. "You see it too, don't you, sir?" The veteran's voice was rough, tinged with something Trump recognized immediately. Pain, but also conviction. Trump gestured to the space on the wall. "Who's missing?" The man took a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "Lieutenant Daniel Harrington. He saved an entire unit, but his name was never carved in." His voice wavered, barely above a whisper. They buried his story. Trump's expression hardened. He turned back to the wall, staring at the empty space as if he could will the name to appear. His mind raced with questions. Mistakes happened, but this wasn't a clerical error. Someone had ensured Lieutenant Harrington's name was left out, and that meant only one thing. There was a story here, buried deep. He straightened, exhaling sharply. "Get me everything on Harrington," he said to his closest advisor. His tone left no room for argument. As he stepped away from the memorial, his gut told him one thing. This wasn't over. Trump's eyes lingered on the blank space, where a name should have been. He had seen countless war memorials, each name etched with precision, a permanent reminder of sacrifice. But this was deliberate. Someone had ensured that Lieutenant Daniel Harrington's name never made it onto the stone. That kind of omission didn't happen by accident. He turned back to the veteran standing nearby. "Tell me everything you know." The man hesitated, studying Trump's expression, as if weighing whether the truth was worth speaking. Then he squared his shoulders. "Sergeant Harold Briggs, sir. Served in the 82nd Airborne." His voice carried the weight of decades of loyalty, but there was something else beneath it, something brittle. "I knew Harrington. Not personally, but I knew what he did." Trump remained silent, giving the man space to continue. "Harrington led a classified mission deep behind enemy lines. The odds were impossible, but he did what no one else could. He got his men out. At least the ones who made it. His squad should have been wiped out, but they weren't because of him." Briggs swallowed hard, his throat working around the words. "They called it a tragedy. I call it a damn lie." Trump's gaze sharpened. Why wasn't he recognized? Briggs shook his head. "That's the part no one talks about. His men never spoke publicly. Those who survived never gave interviews. Officially, that mission barely existed. And Harrington? His name was left off every record that should have honored him." The weight of the words settled between them. The air felt colder, heavier. Trump glanced back at the memorial. "You're telling me a man who saved his entire unit was erased?" Yes, sir. Trump's jaw clenched. He had read about government oversight, bureaucratic red tape, but this was different. This was intentional. The kind of thing that didn't just happen. Someone had made a choice. Turning to his closest advisor, he spoke with quiet authority. I want every military file on Daniel Harrington. Unclassified. I don't care how deep we have to dig. The aide hesitated. Sir, if it was classified, getting access might take time. Trump cut him off. Then move faster. The aide nodded quickly, already pulling out his phone. Briggs exhaled slowly. I don't know if you'll find what you're looking for, Mr. President. Trump turned back to him, his voice steady. I always do. As he walked away, the unease in his chest didn't fade. If Harrington's name had been buried, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a message. And Trump was about to find out why. The Oval Office was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Trump sat behind his desk, his fingers drumming against the polished wood as his top military advisors laid a thick folder in front of him. The seal on the cover read classified, but even before opening it, he knew what that meant. It meant someone had buried something. He flipped it open, his sharp eyes scanning the first few pages. Daniel Harrington's military record was there, but it was thin, too thin for a man who had supposedly led a legendary mission. Rank, date of service, standard commendations. But no Medal of Honor, no Distinguished Service Cross, no acknowledgement of the mission that had supposedly saved an entire unit. It was as if Harrington had served but never lived. One of his advisors cleared his throat. Mr. President, there's more. A second file was placed before him. This one was older, yellowed at the edges. A newspaper clipping, dated decades ago, its headline barely legible. Mission failed. Entire unit lost behind enemy lines. Trump's brow furrowed. He read the article twice, then a third time. The details were vague, but they told a different story than the one Sergeant Briggs had relayed. According to the report, the operation had been a complete disaster. There was no mention of a daring rescue. No survivors. No heroics. Just failure. This isn't the truth, Trump muttered, shaking his head. His advisors exchanged cautious glances. Sir, it's the only official report that exists. Trump exhaled sharply, closing the folder with controlled force. I want answers from the Pentagon. Every document, every declassified piece of intel from that operation. And I want it now. His staff hesitated. Sir, if this was covered up, there's a reason. Trump leaned forward, his voice cold and unwavering. Then let's find out whose reason it was. As if on cue, the secure line on his desk rang. His aide gave him a wary look before answering, then covered the receiver. Sir, it's General Leonard Pierce. Trump took the phone. General? A heavy sigh came through the line. Mr. President, I had a feeling you'd be making calls about Harrington. Trump's grip tightened on the receiver. Then you know what I'm going to ask. I do, Pierce said slowly. And I'm calling to tell you something you won't like. Trump leaned back, his eyes narrowing. If you dig too deep, Pierce continued, his voice grim, you might not like what you find. The line went dead. Trump set the phone down carefully, his mind already racing. Someone had ensured that Lieutenant Harrington was forgotten. And now someone was warning him to stop looking, which only meant one thing. He was closer to the truth than they wanted him to be. No one was ever supposed to read these files. That much was clear from the thick black bars of redactions, the faded stamps of top secret across every page, the layers of clearance that had to be overridden just to get them into the Oval Office. Trump didn't wait. He flipped the first folder open, eyes scanning the document with a speed that came from years of reading between the lines. It wasn't just what was written, it was what wasn't. Harrington's unit had been sent on a mission deep behind enemy lines, but the details were vague. The words extraction and high-value target stood out, but the after-action report was a mess of contradictions. The official version stated the unit had perished, that an airstrike had obliterated the site, before they could be recovered. That was the story printed in the old newspaper clipping. But the classified report told a different story. They had been left behind. The radio logs confirmed it. The team had survived the initial firefight, hunkering down and waiting for extraction that never came. Request after request was sent, urgent, desperate calls for backup. But the response from command had been cold, calculated. Mission compromised. No recovery. The order had been given to wipe the mission from record, to let the world believe the unit had been lost. Trump's grip on the page tightened as he read further. Harrington had refused to accept the order. While most of the men accepted their fate, waiting for an end that seemed inevitable, he had fought. He scavenged supplies, planned an escape route, carried the wounded through miles of enemy territory. He had pulled off the impossible, getting his men home when the government had already written them off. The transcript of his final transmission was chilling. I don't care what orders you have. I have men who are still breathing. I will not let them die out here. It had taken them 6 days, but he had done it. He got them across the border, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. Trump exhaled, his jaw tightening. The survivors should have returned as heroes. But instead, the report concluded with a gut-wrenching detail. Harrington hadn't crossed with them. His name never appeared on the list of recovered soldiers. The last confirmed sighting of him was at the checkpoint. He had stayed behind, covering their escape, ensuring that the men got out while he held the enemy off. His last recorded words were to his second-in-command, "Tell them I did my job." Then, nothing. No further reports. No body recovered. No official declaration of death. Trump flipped to the final page, expecting to see a posthumous recognition, an acknowledgement of his sacrifice. Instead, there was another classified memo. The government had never marked him as Kia. His status had been quietly classified as unknown. The implications hit him like a hammer. They hadn't forgotten him. They had chosen to erase him. The war had been politically delicate at the time. A high-profile rescue mission to retrieve a single soldier, one whose survival contradicted the official report, would have created an international incident. It had been easier to let the world believe he never made it out. Trump clenched his fists, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a betrayal. And now, decades later, he was holding the truth in his hands. He shut the file with controlled fury. Then he looked up at his staff, his voice steady but ice cold. This ends now. The cameras rolled as the nation watched, the presidential seal gleaming behind Trump as he sat at the resolute desk. There was no teleprompter, no carefully crafted script, just him, a stack of classified documents at his side, and the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. He met the lens with a gaze that was unwavering, the same look he had given world leaders and adversaries alike. But tonight wasn't about politics. Tonight was about something far greater. America does not forget its heroes. His voice was steady, firm. But sometimes people in power do. He let the words settle before continuing. Decades ago, Lieutenant Daniel Harrington led a mission behind enemy lines. He should have come home to honor, to recognition. Instead, his name was erased. His story was buried. His sacrifice was ignored. He tapped the classified file in front of him. I've seen the truth with my own eyes. The government knew. They knew he got his men out. They knew he stayed behind. And they chose to let the world believe he never existed. The room behind the cameras was silent. The nation held its breath. I will not allow this injustice to stand, Trump declared. Today, I am issuing an executive order to declassify every record tied to Lieutenant Harrington's mission. His name will be restored. His story will be told. And effective immediately, I am posthumously awarding him the Medal of Honor. A pause. A beat of silence. Then the room erupted into movement, reporters scrambling, headlines forming before the words had even finished echoing through the airwaves. Behind the scenes, the pushback was immediate. Military officials flooded the White House with concerns. The Pentagon warned of diplomatic consequences, of what would happen if old wounds were reopened. Some in his own administration tried to urge caution, to consider the political ramifications. Trump didn't waver. "I don't care about politics," he shot back in a closed-door meeting. "I care about getting this man the respect he deserved decades ago." The resistance was strong, but Trump was stronger. The executive order went through. The process to add Harrington's name to the memorial began. Families of veterans came forward, their voices rising in support. It was no longer just about one man. It was about every soldier who had ever been forgotten, every sacrifice that had ever been pushed aside in the name of political convenience. Then the phone call came. It was late, long after the cameras had stopped rolling, long after most of the White House staff had gone home. The historian Trump had consulted during the investigation was on the other end, his voice tense. "Mr. President," he said, pausing as if bracing himself. "What if I told you Harrington might still be alive?" Trump's grip on the phone tightened, his heart hammering once. Because for the first time since he started digging, he realized maybe this wasn't just about restoring a name. Maybe it was about finding a man who had been lost for far too long. Please click on one of the videos on your screen to watch another story celebrating the human spirit. If you enjoy meaningful stories, please subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on our latest uploads. Thanks for being a part of Unbroken Stories.